everyone. Welcome back to TNC's latest episode of Down the Wire podcast. As some of you will know from previous podcasts, my name is Clare Northveth and CTO at Network Collective. I'm going to be your host today for the next 20 minutes. I'm very pleased to be joined again by Clare Tyndall, one of our principal consultants. Clare, would you want to give a quick intro to yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. As you say, I'm a principal consultant at TNC. I've been at TNC over a decade working with lots of our biggest customers on transformation projects. So looking forward to talking to you today.
Lovely, Clare, thank you. So before we get started, I just wanted to quickly remind our listeners a little bit about TNC and our credentials to talk about the subject today. So TNC, we are UK's largest independent telecoms professional services consultancy. We support over 280 major UK multinational organisations with their strategy, sourcing, development and in-life managed services, particularly around network and telecoms services and technologies. And today's topic, primarily, we're going to be looking at network transformation and the planning of network transformation. So we're going to start really with a bit of a discussion around why we're looking at this as a topic, and particularly why this has changed over the last few years. So yeah, I'm delighted to have Clare on board with me today. She's been involved in a lot of these processes as have I myself. So we're going to try and navigate through the treacherous world of network and telecoms in terms of getting from point A to point B, and try and explain all the kind of tips and tricks that we employ and look to deliver as part of our network transformation process. So let's start, Clare, with the kind of key topic. What has changed, over the last few years? What's different now? Why has it become more difficult to get from, a traditional legacy type of network environment to something that's more modern, and what we're tending to see as a result of our procurement processes?
I think there's lots of reasons, Craig. I think the first one that springs to mind is the fact that the technology itself has gone through a real revolution over the past 18 months to 2 years. So we now have all different types of technology, SD-WAN, SASE, entirely different approach to networks and security. Obviously, we also know we've got entirely different ways of working. People have had to really rethink the way they work. Organizations have had to think how they're going to change and transform the network to support those needs, particularly in flexibility of working, but also in flexibility of how they serve end customers who might be using services. And then beyond that, I think the environment within IT has become increasingly complex recently, and particularly the demands on the network for unified comms, and the demands on the IT team are more complex than ever, and trying to get to grips with all those different moving pieces in order to effect a transformation that's really going to bring benefits in all those areas is a huge piece of work to undertake when perhaps your workforce has been is smaller and is struggling and facing its own challenges with multiple projects itself. And it's a very familiar tale that we hear from customers.
So I think there's a couple of really, really important points there that you've talked about, which maybe we should focus on during this session. So I think you talked about the convergence of network and security services. I guess when we were doing these processes from a procurement point of view and a transformation point of view, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, we were primarily looking at buying MPLS networks. There wasn't much of a security angle to that. I think definitely what we're seeing now is that we're seeing network procurement is we're sourcing secure networks. Security is a very, very core key component to this, but that introduces maybe some complexity, doesn't it, in terms of the people who we need to engage, understanding of what the security requirements are, understanding how that effectively fits around the whole network to develop that secure network process. So yeah, it's a really good point there. I think the other point as well, Clare, was really interesting is around the operating model for networks going forward. I know you've got some specific experience of this around various different projects we've been working on, so maybe it's worth exploring that in a bit more detail as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think picking up on the first point there around MPLS and maybe buying MPLS networks and security separately in that convergence, I think when the answer was sort of always MPLS, which it was for a number of years, it was hard enough anyway if you had a complex business environment to gather the requirements from the different stakeholders and actually to get your baseline under some control, actually understand what sites you had out there, what bandwidths you had out there, what devices there were on the network, whether they were legacy, end of life, etc. That took an awful lot to get to grips with. And you talk about the tips we would give our customers. We would always say that should be your first point of call, the port of call, the baseline, and understanding that. That's now far more difficult. You need to be paying attention to far more different elements within that baseline as you approach that. So you need to understand the security baseline, you need to understand your application environment, as well as the network, as well as your unified comms needs. It all needs to come together if you're thinking about undertaking something like this now. And in terms of the operator model, with MPLS networks, it was the case that it was just very often a managed service model, but there's far more flexibility within that now. And like you say, bringing together the different service towers like security, WAN, etc. You might want to approach the management of that in a completely different way. And again, you're going to have to understand your baseline for your current resources and what they're going to be capable of and how much they cost you and things like that. So understanding the baseline, both from a technological but also from an operator model point of view, needs to be your starting point whenever you undertake this kind of a project.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of our biggest learnings in this last sort of 12, 18 months as we've been doing more and more of these strategic procurements and looking at different types of technologies, is that understanding the importance of that baseline, how that effectively will drive the process, understanding where the return on investment is going to come from, understanding where the operating model might need to change, understanding the different sort of commercial models as well. So I guess one of the other areas we're starting to see now is much more subscription-based models or consumption-based models, where in the past it's been pretty fixed, pretty static, one-off cost, recurring rentals. So yeah, understanding the difference and the change, I guess, is again a key thing and something that needs to be understood early in the process. Is that a true reflection?
Yeah, it's a very accurate reflection. So from the baseline, you need to be understanding your existing operating model, what strengths and weaknesses of that are. You need to be understanding your technical baseline and where precisely that is. You also need to understand your commercial and contractual baseline, where you need to do any short-term extensions to contracts, for instance, in order to align, ready to undertake the transformation project. Then once you've got all that together, you need to be seeking out what are the requirements. So what are the commercial requirements? Is it for subscription? Is it for a capital investment type of project? How do you want to see that structured? How do you want to see, as we've just been talking about, the resource and operating model and the management of the network operating going forward? Understand what needs and requirements are driving that. How are you structuring your applications? What projects are starting to become fundamental to your business? Are those changing, particularly in the light of the a vastly changing economic and global situation? How have those changed over the past year to 18 months? What might be happening in the future? You might not know. How do you build in that flexibility? What is that flexibility in the requirements that you're going to need? So there's an awful lot to consider when you first start that baselining and then that requirements gathering from the business across all the different areas. You need to be very diligent in how you do that.
I guess one of the positives of doing that though early in the kind of transformation process is that there is opportunity to identify some quick wins, isn't there? So a lot of people think that we're going to do a network transformation, we're not really going to deliver benefit until a year or 2 years down the line. But actually that kind of auditing the baseline, understanding exactly what's there, you're highly likely to find some things that you maybe don't need anymore, or they could be recontracted at a lower cost, or you could do some tactical changes to effectively deliver some cost savings. So I think, you know, we are starting to see more on that as being a value add effectively from that audit process at the front end.
Yeah, very much so. The sort of cleanup of the commercials contracts. Maybe you're paying for things that you actually should have cancelled or did cancel. We're seeing that sort of thing all the time. So I think, yeah, maybe there's a tendency to get very excited about all the new technologies that are coming within the market. And I think we're about to come on to talking about that.
Yeah.
But in the first instance, you need to make sure you've dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's and got a good, clean base to work from.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really good. Yeah, so that is a nice kind of segue, and you started talking already about requirements capture and the importance of understanding requirements at different levels, I guess, and not necessarily being led directly from the vendors or from the market, the manufacturers, because I think there are some gaps appearing in the market in terms of, you know, what's perceived as the art of the possible versus what's realistic.
Yes.
And we are starting to see some issues now where, yeah, the dream's being sold, if you like, from a vendor perspective, but when you try to go out and buy that, procure it, deliver it, you're not quite getting the same level of you know, dreaminess, if that's such a thing. So yeah, again, you know, maybe we've touched a little bit around the importance of requirement capture, understanding, you know, from a business objectives perspective, right down to what do SLAs need to look like. Again, you know, maybe talk through that a little bit, Claire. Good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you do need to be very clear on things like how your network needs to perform, what SLAs need to be in place. I think you're right in that there are a lot, and you know, I mentioned a couple of the watchwords earlier around some of the new technologies coming to the market. Gaining an understanding of those parts of the market is absolutely essential. Like you say, and being realistic about which of those are going to actually match up to what you need in terms of the performance of the network and what your requirements are versus what your commercial objectives are, how much is this stuff going to cost compared to what you need to be achieving commercially, because a lot of businesses are under immense commercial pressure after the last 18 months. And so being able to, it's always been a balancing act between commercial and technological improvement, but now it's even harder to achieve. We're finding sometimes when it's coming to, because we assist quite a lot of clients in the deployment phase of their networks as well as the procurement phase, when it comes to deployment, you know, have suppliers done the due diligence, done the proof of concept, done the testing on whether their solutions are actually going to marry up to the requirements or not. So I think putting that detailed due diligence up front as part of the process in order to marry what the market is saying with what your strategy is saying, and you must be clear on your strategy and your business case and what you're hoping to achieve versus what is actually going to be achieved and what the due diligence the supplier has done on it. Making all those things align is difficult, but you definitely need to make sure it happens.
Yeah, I think one other thing, I think that's a really good point. I think one other thing as well is in terms of the objectives, trying to prioritize some of the objectives and make them measurable throughout the process. So, you know, use them objectives to really drive the approach to the market. You know, we'll touch upon this in a second, but you know, the sourcing of some of these services isn't as simple as what it once was either. We've got, you know, disruptive providers in the market. We've got vendors offering services. We've got service integrators there now as well. So you've got to have a very clear definition of, this is what we've got today, these are our requirements, and this is our kind of go-to-market approach. So do you want to maybe touch a little bit on that in terms of that strategic alignment piece and sourcing strategy around, you know, the kind of avenues and the routes that we're taking to that at the minute?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're trying to take a more agile approach than we previously did, and also quite a consultative approach with some of the suppliers, because I think, you know, I think some organizations can hear a buzzword like SD-WAN or SASE and just say, okay, that's what I want my network to look like. In actual fact, even those phrases can encapsulate all different types of models and approaches, but mean different things to different people, mean different things from different suppliers. So you really have to understand from a business and an IT perspective, what are you hoping to achieve here? If you want an application to run in a certain way, what are you hoping to achieve? And instead of necessarily going out just with a very set closed off RFP process that says this is the model and we want it to work, understanding with your supplier long list, what is the art of the possible? These are the things we want to achieve. What can you come back and tell us that you can do? Because then that will often help cement in the minds of the clients the directions that they want to go down. Like we've already talked about so many different things that you need to be considering at the start of the process. It can often be bewildering for clients, and being able to sort of have that agility at the beginning of the process to consult, bring the information to the clients, and then them being able to see the clear pathways to all the very different things that are going on in the market and in their business, we're finding is a helpful way to approach it, which is quite different from maybe just that sort of route one requirements. This is what we want our network to look like, RFP. So that's something that we've been finding. I think you found that on your projects too.
Yeah, I think the kind of agile methodology around going to market with these things, I think is very important these days. I think it's very difficult to go with a very defined specification and say this is what we want, because there's definitely a gap between the vendor capability and the service provider capability at the minute. People do things differently, so it needs to be an agile process and a collaborative process. I think increasingly, you need to be working with the service providers, with the SIs, to understand how you can achieve them objectives together.
We talk with clients quite a lot, I think, about outcome-based sourcing strategy, and that's very definitely what needs to be at the fore at the moment. Yeah,
and I think also the kind of concept of there's almost like a minimum viable product that we should be trying to achieve, but then there's a set of roadmap initiatives potentially for the future, particularly when we start talking about SASE. Because there's as you mentioned, SASE means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and there's various different components in there. You can't go out, you can't specify an RFP or a procurement process say I want to buy SASE, because it doesn't really make any sense. So you've got to drill into what components of that do you actually require. What's the day one requirement in terms of a minimum viable product, and then what's something that you want to innovate on or develop over a period of time. And I think that's the whole agile piece that you talked about there. I think it's becoming increasingly important. So I guess we've touched a little bit, Claire, on the market as a whole now. So we're starting to see more interaction with service integrators. We're obviously seeing a lot of interaction still with traditional managed service providers in the network space, the global WAN providers, for instance. But I guess we're also starting to see, some of the hyperscalers get involved in some of this kind of stuff. Starting to see disruptive providers coming into the market as well. So the market there's a lot of flux in the market at the minute, I think. So again, it points to the importance of understanding what it is that you want, what your requirements are, what it is that you're willing to accept as an MVP, and then trying to identify the right vendors. Is that, that's the kind of process, I guess, that we talk about from an agile point of view?
Yeah, it is. That's very much the type of process that we're talking about. And where you touched on then about we don't really know where things are going to go and about future capabilities, I think that's a crucial point, is that I think if anything can sum up, or if you could try to sum up the experiences of the past 18 months, it's very much delving into the unknown. We try to avoid overuse of the word unprecedented, but it has been unprecedented times, and so therefore you need to make sure that when you're developing your sourcing strategy, your vendor strategy, that you have that flexibility baked into it, and that capability of the vendors to maybe taking things, like you say, on into other directions and into other roadmaps, because you've no idea what the next challenges your business and your IT team might be faced with, and what the network might have to cope with, what other solutions are coming down the line from a technical capability point of view and development from the suppliers. So I think you have to be prepared for that unknown and be flexible enough to cope with that unknown when developing your sourcing strategy and your procurement processes.
Yeah, it feels like the only consistent in the process at the minute is change.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
we're seeing that from a customer point of view and from a market point of view, I guess. So yeah, that the agility to adapt to change throughout a process, throughout a transformation process, I think is definitely key. Okay, that's really cool. So I think right. So if we just quickly revisit what we talked about then, so baselining the importance of that, understanding what your current costs are, your current technologies are, the life cycle of infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. Um, a very clear definition of requirements, right, through from business level to the kind of solution the service is going to be operating it, and then a well-defined sourcing approach, which effectively is outcome driven, as agile as possible. So we get through all of that. That's great. We're getting into a point now where we've identified providers potentially that can deliver this service. I guess what next? This is another area of change. When we start talking about how you contract for some of these services and the kind of the frameworks around this. So how do we bring that level of flexibility, agility into the contract? What are some of the things that we see in change in that space?
So I think greater flexibility on things like minimum commitments. That's obviously a positive step from a buying perspective. And I think clauses written into contracts to allow flexibility in things like divestment, but also incorporating technical change within the contract and making sure that that's at no penalty. So that flexibility in the contractual model, we've touched on it a bit before, but that is vital to cope with all the sheer scale of change that we're seeing. I think you just have to really keep an open mind when it comes to contracting at the moment, and not accept. I think probably many of the people watching will be familiar with telecoms contracts that were very restrictive in the past. Don't accept that at the moment, because it just isn't fit for purpose for the constantly changing environment and landscape that we're seeing. I think definitely push on that flexibility.
Yeah, definitely second that. I think we are definitely in this kind of revolutionary stage, I think, in networks, in the network space at the minute, aren't we? We're definitely seeing a significant change from where we were 5 years ago, and the contracts that are around still today around the sort of legacy contracts into what we need in the future. It's definitely got to be more flexible. It's got to not be based on certain commitments to connections or revenue even. It's got the ability to change technologies, whether that's at a physical level or a virtual level. It's got to be moved into a more sort of as a service type capability, as well as we again start to more subscription and consumption models. So yeah, that's good to know, and we are seeing some success, I guess, in that space. I mean, this is probably an area where it's not as easy to execute some of these things, because at the end of the day, it's still a legal document, and I think a lot of the service providers, the SI providers, the legal teams have not quite caught up with the speed of change in technology. So we do still run into some challenges there, I think, don't we? But again, it comes down to the planning. It comes down to what is your minimum viable products. What do you need from a flexibility level? Bit of forward thinking, doesn't it? I guess.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Okay,
cool. And then I guess post contract, and this is probably another topic for another day, but post contract, what are we starting to see here? So how are people executing these things? Are we seeing this being rapid transformations? For instance, SD-WAN and SASE. Are we seeing that revolutionise the way that people can deliver their networks, or is it still a fairly slow and steady type of process? Deliver the overlay, deliver the underlay, deliver some of the services.
Well, I think it will depend on the project, but I think underestimating all stages of a transformation project and how long it will take. All the stages that we've been talking about so far: baselining, requirements gathering, sourcing, contracting. All of that tends to take longer than clients think it will. And then the project deployment itself tends to be more complex and takes longer and requires more planning than clients think it will. And that can often be underestimated. That said, things like SD-WAN, things like zero touch deployment are there to be had, but it's not a sort of magic wand to instantly transform to networks that roll themselves out. So I think understanding and being realistic about what your resource requirements are going to be in that space is something you should consider very seriously.
Yeah, 100% agree. Very well put. Claire, I am conscious that we are probably at our 20-minute mark. So I think that's been a very, very interesting podcast today. So thank you very much for your time. I'm sure the listeners will appreciate it as well. So yeah, finally, everybody, thanks for listening. If you do have any questions about this topic or any other topic in this network and telecom space, you know where you can get in touch with us, either directly through our socials or via our website, networkcollective.co.uk. We look forward to speaking to you again in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you, Claire.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.